Good morning, everyone. My name is Bruce Stokes, and I'd like to welcome you to this GMF webinar on what to expect from the next U.S. Congress. As I said, my name is Bruce Stokes. I'm a visiting senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund. And we have with us today Ira Shapiro, author of 3 books on the U.S. Senate, including the latest one out this fall entitled The Betrayal: How Mitch McConnell and the Senate Republicans Abandoned America. We have Bill Kristol, editor-at-large at the center-right publication The Bulwark, and the former chief of staff to Vice President Dan Quayle. And we have Jessica Taylor, the Senate and governor's editor for the Cook Political Report with Amy Walter, the premier political newsletter in Washington. And Jessica is the first woman senior author of the authoritative Almanac of American Politics. But most importantly, she's an alum of the National Journal where I worked for 23 years. So it's great to be with her.
I'm coming to you from Watergate.
Let me thank all 3 of you for appearing with us today. Given your experience, I think our viewers will benefit greatly from your wisdom and insights. And before we start, I'd also like to thank William Stewart Wood and all the team at GMF for making this session possible. And we will be taking questions from the audience after presentations and response to some questions by our speakers. I'd like to just remind our viewers that the U.S. goes to the polls on Tuesday, November 8. It's always the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. You may ask, why November? Why that date? It's because it's after the harvest, and that's when the farmers can come to market. Of course, only 2% of Americans are farmers these days, but tradition is tradition. Every 2 years, all 435 seats in the House of Representatives are up for re-election, and a third of the Senate. The best estimates are that about 20% of these 435 House seats are actually contestable, and maybe a half a dozen or more of the Senate seats are really contestable. The Senate currently has 50 Republicans and 50 Democrats, so a shift of just 1 seat will change the balance of power in the Senate. And since the rules of the Senate are that the vice president breaks all ties and she's a Democrat, the Democrats have to at least retain 50 seats to retain control of the Senate. In the House, the Democratic majority is razor thin, so a loss of even a half dozen or so seats will flip the control of the House. With that as a background, let's start on the Senate, which is more contestable. Jessica, a week out from the election, how are things looking in the half dozen closest Senate contests?
So if you'd asked me this in August, I would have had a very different answer. I think that was when we saw a summer of hope for Democrats, especially after the Dobbs decision that sent Roe v. Wade question back to the states. We saw a lot of, historically, the party in power of the president's party should lose seats. They lose an average of 2 Senate seats, over about 20 or so House seats. But when you look at this, and Democrats had a map with 3 incumbents, particularly in Nevada, Georgia, and Arizona, that Biden won those states by less than 3 points, where we've seen his approval ratings drop across the country, particularly in these swing states. That was very problematic for some of these Democrats in this type of cycle where it felt like it was shaping up to be in the spring. What sort of gave Democrats still an option, really, that kept them in the game, were that there were open seats that Republicans were now having to defend, and that they had not expected to, or really, if the incumbent had run in Pennsylvania and Ohio, I'm not sure that these would have been on the table. So they've had to sort of especially rescue Ohio. Pennsylvania now is their best opportunity to flip a seat. And we saw in Pennsylvania, John Fetterman opening up a lead there in over the.
I think we've lost.
And it really is.
Unfortunately, I think we've lost Jessica's audio and her video is frozen. So until we get back to that, why don't we turn to Bill? Bill, given your past service in the Republican administrations, what do you expect in the House races? Will it be a landslide victory of 30 to 40 seats or a more modest 12 to 25 seat victory for the Republicans? And more importantly, what do you expect the Republicans to do with their majority once they are in control of the House?
First of all, it's good to be with all of you. Good to be with GMF, who I've worked with and attended many GMF conferences and meetings over the years, some of them in Brussels and Berlin and more exotic places than Zoom, but happy to be with everyone here on Zoom as well, and with such distinguished colleagues. So I'm a little less of I think it's more up in the air than people think, for what it's worth. I mean, the polling has gone both ways. People are a little bit kind of a herd mentality. The Democrats in the summer did have an impressive surge, pretty unusual, when they're the party in power, and everyone thought, oh my God, they're going to win everything. And then the Republicans had a predictable actually come back, and everyone decided, oh, they're going to win everything. There are a lot of close races. I mean, if you look at the most recent polls just on the House, I think there's a range of outcomes, but I think it's personally more from 0 to 25 or 30 seats than from 15 to 40 or whatever. But you know what? When you have a lot of close races, they can go either way. And they do often go, but not always, in one way. That is to say, if there's a national wave, races that are within 1 or 2% tend to topple one direction or the other, Senate and House, governor too, I'd say. But if you have conflicting kind of mini waves, which I think is what we're seeing in this election, different things in different regions, individual candidates matter a lot. Candidate quality, as Mitch McConnell said, sort of half jokingly, matters a lot. And health, as we've seen in Pennsylvania, may matter for a key Senate seat. So, I think it's very much up in the air. If Republicans win the House, which is certainly likely, probably 3 and 5, 4 and 5 chance, I guess is the conventional view. What's going to happen? I'll just make 2 quick points. First point was, people do need to be. I'm very worried about election night and the next week or month. I mean, people assume January 6th happened and could never happen again. I hope it never happens again. But we have a lot of people running on the Republican side who have laid the predicate to say that these elections have been stolen. We're going to have a lot of states that will count the early ballots, the early vote late. There'll be states where some places, usually big cities, come in later than other areas. And so there will be chances for candidates who want to cause trouble. And we have a whole infrastructure that's now dedicated to causing trouble. It's a chunk of the Republican Party, honestly, and a pretty non-trivial chunk of the Republican Party that is approves of what Trump did in 2020, thinks the system, either thinks or pretends to think the system is rigged, has a lot of voters revved up to think the system is rigged. And so I think observers here and abroad need to, and I say this very, I wish I didn't have to say this, just need to be ready for a certain amount of turmoil, chaos, motivated chaos, so to speak, on November 8th and maybe for a week or 2 afterwards. I hope it doesn't happen. I think it'd be very good for this country and therefore good for the world if we had a very neat election where people could, as in the olden days, 99% of the candidates, 99.9% concede gracefully, and whether close races, there's an orderly recount or orderly count and then a recount. And it's not a big, no one's mobilizing armed voters to go to state capitals, and state legislators aren't threatening to hold new elections, and candidates aren't threatening not to recognize the results of the race. But I'm pretty worried that could happen. In terms of the House, assuming it's a Republican House, I guess I just make really 2 quick points. I mean, I don't think policy changes much. If Biden can veto anything they do, they may not control the Senate. Presidents have a huge amount, still have a lot of authority. I think foreign policy, and I don't think the Republicans are united enough on some of these big issues to really cause huge policy changes. I can't really think of an area where there would be major changes. I think foreign policy would stay pretty much on the course it's on there. Biden has some Republican support on Ukraine and other things. And so, I don't see much. I mean, there could be some noise and some stuff that could alarm allies and alarm Ukrainians, and I think that's unfortunate. But and unfortunately embolden Putin. But I don't see much of a big thing there. The economy is on whatever course it's on. The Fed will do its thing. I mean, I just don't see serious legislation getting passed they may pass stuff in the Republican House, but it's not going to get passed by the Senate, where most of it would need 60 votes, even if Republicans control the Senate, and not signed by President Biden. So I think from a policy point of view, if you think things are on a reasonably good course, which I tend to, in the big picture policy areas, I think it'll stay mostly on that course. But I think the chaos will be on the political side, not the policy side. The degree of performative screaming and yelling in the House, the impeachment of people, whether it's Attorney General Garland or President Biden, the investigations into Hunter Biden, the heightened rhetoric, the unfortunate rhetoric that can lead to violence, as we've seen recently. I mean, I think it's going to be a very ugly 2023, 2024. And it's not as if there's no one on the left who will be prompted by, extremist rhetoric on the right to perhaps counteract. And so I think the idea that we're going to have civility or bipartisanship, I wish we did, but I don't see much of that happening on the House side. And final point, with Nancy Pelosi, I mean, McCarthy will be a weak leader, I would say, if he is the speaker. You have different parts of the conference that are not entirely wed to him and that will pressure him. Trump, God knows what Trump will say from the outside. I mean, just Kevin McCarthy decides this is the schedule, this is the strategy, this is the agenda. Trump weighs in. What does that look like the next day, right? That's not a normal situation to say. And then Marjorie Taylor Greene weighs in. But then, to be fair, 20 more mainstream Republicans say, wait a second, I'm not going along with some vote to defund Ukraine. That's totally irresponsible. Mike Gallagher and other members of Congress say that. And then what happens? So, I mean, I think the degree to which we are used to a Nancy Pelosi run House, this is not going to look like that. And the Democratic Party presumably won't have Nancy Pelosi in charge. She'll step down. And the Democratic Party has had Nancy Pelosi in charge in the House for, 18 years, I think. Is that right? 2005, she did so, right? So, whatever the math is, 18 to 17 years. So what does that look like? I mean, there are capable people lined up to replace her, but so I think the degree of chaos, not in policy, which I think stays mostly on course, but in politics in 2023 is going to be a little bit jarring.
Great. And I think your point about Pelosi is right. I mean, she ran a very disciplined caucus, which her Republican counterparts couldn't do for years and may not be able to do going forward. Ira, given your writing on the Senate, including your first book, The Last Great Senate, and your new McConnell book, and your service on the staff of the Senate as a young man, how do you think McConnell and the Republicans will act if they win the Senate, if it's 50-50 again, or if they're in the minority?
Thanks, Bruce. And it's great to be with such a wonderful panel and to reach the GMF audience. So I appreciate this opportunity. Look, from my standpoint, the thesis of my book is that Mitch McConnell and the Senate Republicans failed the country at a catastrophic level by not stopping Donald Trump's assault on our democracy on the one hand, and using the opportunity instead to pursue their most important objectives, namely stacking the Supreme Court with a right-wing majority. And it was my hope, and a month or two ago, as Jessica said, when the political atmosphere seemed more positive for Democrats, it was my hope that the Democrats would pick up 2 to 4 seats and weaken McConnell's hold on the country. To be honest, I've made the argument that we've been living in Mitch McConnell's America for 14 years. He has been the most decisive political figure in terms of deciding what would be done and what wouldn't be done. And that was before Trump came along. Now, if we have a situation where it's most likely that the Senate will be closely, it might be 50-50 again. It might be 51-49, one way or the other. McConnell will have a disproportionate amount of power, whether he's in the majority or he's still the minority leader, but close to 50-50. So what does that mean? Let me give you the optimistic scenario. Having achieved his overriding objective of stacking the Supreme Court, McConnell, age 80, might have some incentive to finish his career on a more positive note, trying to be something like the senator and statesman he once thought he might be, rather than simply a partisan. It's not totally implausible to me. He's been on good behavior this year, joining in some bipartisan legislative efforts on the one hand, and strongly supporting, I think Bill referred to it, but strongly supporting President Biden and joining with him on the Ukraine war and funding for the efforts to support Ukraine. From a European standpoint, I do think it's very important that McConnell, unlike Trump, favors NATO and despises Putin. So on those things, he may be pretty good. On the other hand, we have a situation where a Republican House and anything like close to a Republican majority does mean the end of any Biden legislative agenda. There will be, whatever. Biden had his struggles, but he got a lot of things done. And he won't be able to do that with a Republican House. So that's a concern. But I love to think about McConnell, who is the ultimate politician and very successful at what he does. I think he actually enjoys a situation where he'll have a great deal of power. He loves the contrast between him and Kevin McCarthy, who is a craven and weak, likely to be a craven and weak speaker. And McConnell likes to distinguish himself from Trump. He may ultimately conclude this is his moment to be more like the mentors and heroes that he professed to have. Kentucky's Henry Clay, the great compromiser. John Sherman Cooper, a great senator and statesman. And Mike Mansfield, the best of all Senate leaders. A positive scenario, possible, but I wouldn't count on it. More likely to me is that his goal remains his power and Republican Party power. He will begin immediately to think about what do we have to do to win the presidency in 2024. And despite the fact that Mitch McConnell and others, but particularly Mitch McConnell, would like nothing better than for Donald Trump to disappear. He hates Donald Trump. If the Republicans choose to nominate Donald Trump again, you know that Mitch McConnell will be for him. Change too much. I want to add one postscript, just following up on Bill's points about the political climate and violence. In Europe, countries are struggling with enormously challenging problems, Europe and the UK. If you look at what Germany is going through in policy terms and how to deal with its energy future and its manufacturing, they're really difficult problems. But in our country, we have the overlay of political madness that is divided and consuming the country at the moment. And so from a European standpoint, you have to worry about the condition of American democracy. I don't know how others feel, but if you had told me in the last 18 months or 20 months that Joe Biden would become president, we would get through most of the serious parts of the COVID challenge, we would have an insurrection, and despite all of that, we would be more divided than ever. I wouldn't have believed it. So the future of American democracy and its condition is still the central challenge going forward.
Well, on that note, and to follow up on that, I want to pose a question to Jessica. Given your work covering state level politics, how do you think the outcomes of the state level may play out in terms of how elections are run in the future, and what this may mean for American democracy? And to add two data points to what Ira and Bill have raised, a CBS News Battleground Tracker poll released this weekend showed that 3/4 of Republicans, registered voters, say that citizens should be allowed to challenge officials as they count the vote. And 2/3 of Republicans say that the private citizens should be allowed to patrol polling places and ballot boxes. And for those who haven't been following this closely, a Trump-appointed judge in Arizona said that they can also carry guns as they patrol these ballot spots. So the potential there for things getting out of hand, I guess, is even greater. But Jessica, what do you think about especially these races for Secretary of State in American states, where the Secretary of State is actually not a foreign affairs person? He's the guy or the woman who runs the elections. But the governor's races, and how that may all affect how elections are run in certain states in the future.
Yeah. Since my connection cut out earlier, I just want to hop back and finish my thought on the Senate, if that's okay first.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
I sort of where we see things now, I've moved, whereas Pennsylvania and Arizona, we had it lean Democratic about a month ago. We've moved back into the toss-up column. Those have really tightened. I'm particularly looking at the Pennsylvania Senate race, whether Fetterman's debate performance, I think could have raised concerns about his fitness for office. We saw that in at least one day of tracking of a New York Times Siena poll that came out today. But I think at this point, the best outcome Democrats can hope for is staying a 50-50 Senate. And I thought even a month ago, 51-49 either way was possible. I think Republicans could pick up as many as 2, 3 on a very, very good night. But even a month ago, Republicans were saying 2 would be excellent with what they were sort of staring down. So I'm not sensing a major shift, and we still see the Senate as a toss-up, but I think Republicans could have just a very, very slight edge at this point with some of the polling and things that we are seeing coming out. Just to go to the state things, governors kind of get short shrift when midterm elections, but I think
oh no, we've lost Jessica again. So I'll take this time actually to say to our viewers that we are happy to answer, have you pose questions and try to answer them. So put your questions in the chat function so that we can sort through them and pose them to our speakers. And Jessica's back, I think. So let's
I'm not sure what's going on with our internet this morning. It's usually okay.
Yeah.
So people saw during COVID how important governors are, and we saw during the 2020 election how important they are at making decisions of whether or not to overturn elections. In Georgia, Brian Kemp stood up to Trump, refused to overturn the election, faced a primary challenge. He was sort of Trump's kryptonite in a way, won that overwhelmingly, far more than anyone expected against David Perdue. And he's on pace for re-election against Stacey Abrams. And I think that won him a lot of sort of some crossover support for handling that this way. It's the same sort of states that were challenged last time. Arizona, I think, is going to be a very key one there. A very, very strong possibility that Carrie Lake, who's been a conspiracy theorist, election denier, former TV news anchor, and there in Phoenix, I think I would put a sort of a pinky on the scale for her over Democratic Secretary of State Katie Hobbs, who has not been a particularly strong candidate. And you could see some of those election deniers down the ballot for Secretary of State winning as well. Nevada is another place where we could see this. I think Nevada Republicans might have a slight edge there, some good early vote numbers, but we see, of course, the influx of Republicans voting on election day.
Jessica, could you maybe just interrupt you for a second? So our viewers, especially those in Europe, maybe understand this better. It's like, what could a potential election denier who becomes the Secretary of State in state X, whatever state, what might that imply? How could they affect how the elections are then run 2 years from now?
I mean, if Trump comes back and says these elections are fraudulent, and then you can have them try to overturn the results, if this, depending upon where the state legislature is, still different rules in every state, but Trump would have allies there, whereas largely Governor Doug Ducey, who is term limited in Arizona, stood up to him as well. As did, again, Secretary of State down ballot was a Democrat, but we saw sort of even Republicans sort of hold this line. And I'm not sure that we're going to see the same thing if some of these Republican candidates win. Wisconsin's another very critical state, probably the closest split 50-50. And, you could have Tim Michaels, the Republican nominee there, has at times said the election was not valid. At times he's sort of gone back and forth. The bright spot for Democrats, I think, is in Pennsylvania, one of the ones that was challenged on the floor, where the Secretary of State is appointed by the governor. But Josh Shapiro is running away with that race there over complete election denier Doug Mastriano, who's probably one of the worst candidates running this cycle. So I think there's a little bit more of a comfort that Shapiro will win and appoint someone that would have election integrity and different things as we see it. Georgia, though, even I think there with even Republicans winning, Brad Raffensperger, that was targeted heavily by Trump, he's on path to win pretty easily. So it's not just all Republicans, but you do have places, and I think Michigan, I think the Democrats going to win there. That's a state that's looking a little bit up, but I would keep an eye particularly on Arizona, Nevada, and Wisconsin.
No, I agree with you. And again, Jessica will be back in a minute. I mean, one thing I think our international listeners may not be aware of is that there is a movement in conservative circles in the United States. I think it's called the independent legislators theory, which is basically that if you read the Constitution literally, it says that state legislatures get to determine who are the electors in our electoral college. And it does not mention who won the majority of the vote in that state. While it had become that tradition over 100 years of that being the case. If you go to the US Constitution and you read that sentence, it's, I think, pretty clear that state legislatures can do whatever they want to do in terms of appointing electors. And that also will factor in, I think, to the makeup of the state legislature, who's the governor, et cetera, and what the mood is in that particular state in 2024. So Jessica, you're back. So I want you to be able to finish your thought.
I'm not sure where it cut out, but I would say that Arizona, Nevada, and Wisconsin are probably the most likely places where we could see some of these election deniers win. That would be really critical. I think Arizona is the most likely at this point, but you should feel pretty good about Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Georgia at this point, I think.
So Bill and Ira, do you want to make any other comments about the future of American democracy as we look at this election?
We had just an election yesterday in Brazil, and I believe, though there's rumblings of election denial and Trumpy-like behavior by Trump's buddy Bolsonaro, they had a close election. I mean, they have popular vote, simple majority, but it was 50.9 to 49.1, massive, country. And there were irregularities, mostly from the right, actually trying to suppress, I think, some Lula vote. Anyway, they seem to have, there's less right now. It looks to me like they have more acceptance of election results than we do. I'm just not making up, I am being somewhat rhetorical, but I just think, honestly, if we looked at a foreign country and saw major swing states, as Jessica was just saying, with people running for governor and secretary of state, pledging, not just I have some doubts about 2020, pledging to going forward to make sure that, pledging at least an openness to not going in the normal way of certifying the results of the winner of the popular vote. There'll be attempts in state legislatures to try to overturn laws that constrain state legislatures before the election and so forth. We would look at a foreign country. If this were happening in Europe or in South America, we would say, this is pretty bad. This is a little dicey for one of the two major parties, one chunk of one of the two major parties, and not a trivial chunk, and not a chunk that's repudiated by everyone else, is sort of in the business of okaying not accepting election results and not having a peaceful or not having a peaceful transfer of power. And again,
mean,
and what I'd say just is the acceptance of the extremists by the mainstream Republicans is what makes this so dangerous. As Jessica said, in 2020, in Arizona and Georgia, mainstream Republicans wouldn't go along with Trump. But in 2022, Doug Ducey, the governor of Arizona, who behaved well in 2020, is endorsing Kari Lake and spending tens of millions of dollars on her behalf for the Republican Governors Association, which he heads. That doesn't mean he would literally endorse, I don't think he would, overturning an election in 2024, but he may well have helped create a situation where the party as a whole will do so. And the same with Kevin McCarthy supporting and elevating really Marjorie Taylor Greene. She stood with McCarthy when they announced their agenda a month ago or so ago in Pittsburgh. She's not relegated to kind of the fringes of the party the way might once been the case. They've always been extremists in American politics on both sides. They still are on both sides. But it's kind of unique now to have them so close to the center of power in the Republican Party, to say nothing of the fact that the ex-president, who is now basically a defender of the January 6th insurrection, is the leading candidate to be the Republican nominee. So that's, I think, what is alarming about democracy's standing and status in the U.S.
I think most Americans don't realize that that the image of the United States and our soft power of a strong democracy that everybody wants to emulate it no longer exists. A majority of Europeans, for example, in a Pew Research Center poll a couple of years ago, said they do not see the United States as a model for their democracy. And I dare say, my guess is most Americans do see their democracy as a model. And we pay a price internationally. Ira, do you have any thoughts on the democracy?
Well, first, I would say to the audience that Bruce has written an excellent article on this in Foreign Affairs, discussing the deterioration of America as an example and our inability and soft power. We're undermining it because we don't look like a democracy. The second point is that I think Bill has made a crucial point in his work. The people who know better and stay silent have been a real problem here. And if you go back, and by that I mean the McConnells and other Senate Republicans who for instance, knew that the 2020 election was conducted fairly, but refused to recognize Biden as the president-elect for weeks. And if you go back and look at it, the period of time after the election and for 5 weeks after that, when the Republicans, for the most part, did not acknowledge Biden as the president-elect, that was when the big lie spread. And 50 million Republicans, 70% of the Trump vote, reached the conclusion that the election was stolen and rigged because nobody was telling them otherwise who they believed. So it's a lesson, and unfortunately, it's a lesson that people haven't learned, that the people who have these positions of influence and know better and stay silent are a real problem. And they've aided and abetted in that regard the extreme elements. They wouldn't say they're extremists, but they've let the extremists run wild.
Can I add one, Chris?
Go ahead, Jessica. Go ahead. Yeah.
I think a key part of the deterioration that we are seeing is the fact that primaries are producing more extreme nominees, and so that's your motivation to not work across the aisle, because these are decided in primaries by such a small part of the electorate. And then we've seen candidates that have tried to pivot toward the center after winning, and whether that's be successful, we'll see. But I think some of the places where I'm really intrigued, because we are seeing some election administration changes really in how this are decided, or states that now have ranked choice voting. Maine, that is only at the federal level, it's not going to be at the governor's race. And then Alaska just implemented this top 4 primary system where the top 4 candidates, regardless of party, advance, and then it's ranked choice voting. And that special House election we had for the Alaska House seat, that produced a more moderate moderate nominee or a more moderate winner in Democrat Mary Patola over Sarah Palin, who probably even our foreign audiences has heard of. And Lisa Murkowski is the only senator up for re-election this cycle who voted to convict President Trump in his second impeachment trial. In a traditional primary, she would have lost. In fact, she has lost in a primary before and then came back with a write-in campaign. But because of the ranked choice voting, she will get enough, at least second place Democrats. She gets a lot of her support from independents and Democrats already, not just Republicans. But her Trump-backed primary challenger is not going to win because of the way that is set up. Nevada is also looking at setting this up. So that's a key part to me, if sort of moving away from maybe the traditional primary cycle and having people weigh in on, you have an array of candidates that can advance, and then to get to a majority of the vote with ranked choice.
I mean,
it
if I
is.
can add one point,
Yeah, go ahead.
another slightly optimistic point, sort of like Jessica's, but on the foreign policy side, I mean, I would say on the sort of upside of U.S. power and soft power, I mean, if you had told me after the chaos of the 2020, November 2020 to January 6, 2021, that the attacks on Biden, his taking over with 50-50 Senate and tiny majority in the House, that he would have been able to conduct, and then I think Afghanistan, which I think was a mistake, whether it was a mistake or not, certainly hurt him politically and lessened his power, you might say, to convince people. If you had told me we could pull off the Ukraine foreign policy we pulled off over the last 8 months with good U.S. work, good diplomatic work, and solidifying the alliance, and we don't deserve by any means all or perhaps most of the credit for it. A lot of other countries did a lot of work, but we were key to it, obviously, and Ukrainians think we're key to it, and the Europeans think we're key to it. Putin thinks we're key to it, for that matter, and that's gone pretty well. And there's been no undercutting of it here to speak of. Really little attempts to by some of the Republicans and a couple of progressive Democrats who got quickly shut down by Pelosi. So I mean, for all the talk about the institutions remain pretty strong, the U.S. abilities to help others around the world remain unmatched, obviously, in terms of equipment and other things as well. I don't know, that for me has been heartening, and I think cuts against. I mean, I really do wonder whether Ukraine could be a moment where people are reminded what's at stake here and everywhere else, and where the U.S. and the Biden administration's been, in that respect, has been less hampered than I guess one might have expected, back in August, September of just a year ago, right? If you had said a year ago, after the Afghanistan pullout, Biden would be getting authorization and appropriations to spend tens of billions of dollars to help Ukraine, that the help would be well delivered. I've got to say the Defense Department seems to have done a very good job of getting it out the door. You can quibble with the speed with which we've done some things, but the NATO alliance is held together well. The most recalcitrant countries have come along. We've got NATO's expanding by 2 countries. I mean, it's a pretty good testimony to the fact that we remain key to the liberal international order, and everyone else thinks we're key. And even if we mess up a fair amount, they're going to try to make sure we stay key, to it. But ultimately, obviously, if this goes on too long in the U.S., it really, really weakens us. But it is a little bit of a, Ukraine war is terrible in so many ways in terms of the humanitarian and other factors. But in terms of strengthening, in a way, the liberal world order and the U.S. role in it, I'm a little struck by that.
Now, we got a number of questions from the audience, so I'd like to turn to that if we can. Our first question was really a foreign policy and foreign trade really related question. Anybody has a view on this, about whether the impact of this election, the change in power possibly in the Congress, will in fact impact trade relations with Europe. This is from someone from Digital Europe. There are a number of trade-related issues that are beginning to build with Europe, but trade is not a major issue in this campaign by a long shot. Do anybody have any thoughts on that before we move to the next question? Ira used to be a trade lawyer.
Yeah, Ira, you worked there. You go for you. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a way former U.S. trade official, but I try to keep up on these issues. From my standpoint, there is more of a consensus in trade now than there has been in a long time. And the consensus in trade that exists is, number one, we really needed a North American free trade agreement, notwithstanding how much people disliked NAFTA. And so they updated it. And number two, there's a bipartisan agreement that our trade policy with China and our policy toward China generally had to be much tougher. So those are the elements of a consensus on trade in the United States. With respect to US-Europe trade, look, it always appears that we should be able to have a deeper trade relationship with Europe than we do. But real differences on regulatory issues continue to always remain. So whether it's food or chemicals or the right of privacy or competition policy, there are genuine differences between the US and the EU. So I wouldn't expect trade to be a major issue, nor would I expect there to be too much change. We're still going to be groping for answers to the trade questions in a system where the WTO is very weak and where real differences between the US and the EU on regulatory matters continue.
I would just add that Biden has been timid in my view, in removing the Trump tariffs on Europe. And these are our allies. We're now fighting a war together. We are literally fighting. It's the biggest war since 1945, and people really have not been serious. We're been involved in certainly the biggest war in Europe since 45, I should say. People haven't been serious about this. I mean, it's idiotic, as if in the middle of World War II, we were like hampering the importing of steel and other things from another country where we needed it to help make material for the war, leaving everything else aside. So Biden's been timid because there is opposition in both parties to moving ahead on freer trade. He hasn't removed the Trump tariffs, but he hasn't done anything in the other direction to speak of either. So I think the good news is it's the status quo, which is a pretty free trade friendly, I guess you could say, status quo. I do think after the pandemic, I wish people had made this point in the US government. Is there ever been a better case for reasonably free trade and movement of capital, and especially for the US and Europe and back and forth, than the vaccines? Where were the vaccines made? Where were the vaccines discovered and invented? And literally most of the vaccines used in the US, if I'm not mistaken, at one point this was true, were physically made in Europe. And incidentally, people obeyed contracts by sending us vaccines, even when Europe was falling behind us in vaccination rate. Those vaccines were made, many of them, in parts of Europe. And so the idea that, we're going to go back to some kind of autarky or whatever is ridiculous at this point, I think. But I wish people had taken advantage of the solution to the pandemic, but the mitigation of the pandemic a little more by saying this is, do we really want not to be able to share the fruits of scientific research and the ability to manufacture these things around the world? Anyway, but I do think the lessons sort of sunk in though in a way that you can't really, people are totally idiots about this, that we do not want to go back to a protectionist US. So I think the bad news is not huge progress in the next 2 years. The good news is not much movement the other direction. Trump's election did not mark, I think this is the good news, Trump's election did not mark a beginning of protectionism as US policy. We're not in 1930 again, there's nothing like Smoot-Hawley. I mean, I think that's a good thing. Trump's election marked a lot of other things. Immigration, on the other hand, we've been totally timid, and Trump really may have marked a change of policy in that respect, in my view, a very damaging change from our point of view.
So we've got another question. We've got a question on kind of the economic implications of the outcomes of this election and what they may mean for the future election. I mean, I think as an observer, it seems to me one of the interesting things is that for the most part, polls tell us that the public is worried most about inflation and or the economy, which is probably one and the same thing. But there's the Democrats and the Biden administration seem to get no credit for the very strong economic performance up until the last few months. We still have growth in the last quarter, lots of job creation, very low unemployment, but inflation and concerns about inflation seem to trump it all. Not to make it, no pun intended, but the point being that will a Republican-controlled House, for example, try to push certain economic issues that would lead to maybe even more controversy inside Washington. Any thoughts on that?
I mean, Republicans' main message on the economy is just that we had too much spending and that's driving inflation. But I also think that even if you can point to those economic indicators, but ultimately it comes down to what voters are feeling and what they're seeing. And what they're feeling and seeing is that your grocery prices are higher. You're paying quite a bit more. Gas prices are you may not realize what the grocery prices are until you've checked out, but like gas prices you see every day driving around. So you're very cognizant of when they're going up or down, and they were going down back in August and September. And that's not a coincidence that was when Democratic sort of hopes were rising and different things. And now that they're starting to go back up a little bit, there's more uncertainty. But again, I think it just boils down to those pocketbook issues, and it's what those kitchen table issues, what voters are feeling. And there's not a lot of confidence right now. And certainly the inflation is not just a US problem that we see, it's one clearly affecting Europe and the UK as well. But again, voters want to blame someone, and there's one party that controls everything. So that is who they are going to blame. And absent of, Rick Scott's plan that did more harm than good, there's not, Republicans haven't had to have an agenda to point to other than we won't be Democrats.
Yeah, it's interesting. In one of the polls that came out this weekend, Republicans believed that gas prices would go down if the Republicans won this election, and that Democrats, did not believe that. But it has to do with what I have long thought is the case, is that publics often just want politicians and the president in particular to be daddy and to solve problems. And inflation isn't an issue that the president has almost no control over, but it doesn't matter.
So on energy, I mean, this is where the Democratic Party hurts itself, in my opinion, as a sort of ex-Republican who would, I guess, be friendly to moderate Democrats. Energy production is higher in the US than it was when Donald Trump left office. We never hear that. Why do we never hear that? Because a lot of that energy production is traditional energy. You can't go overnight to new forms of energy, and that is, and a lot on the left, for reasonable reasons, they think climate change, don't like that Biden has not in fact cracked down much on the extractive industries, on oil and gas and coal. He hasn't. Now, most of the money that he got earlier this year in the big legislation was for new industries, for solar and wind. So that was a victory, and I think it was a genuine victory, incidentally, which he also doesn't take much credit for some reason. But the Democrats are so conflicted on some of this stuff. I mean, a normal administration, or administration in sort of Ira's in my day, a Democratic administration would have answered the thing by saying, you know what, we've increased gas production some, we're open to increase, and oil production some, we were open to doing it more on an emergency basis. Biden's been very tentative. Understandably, his coalition's very split on it. So Democrats have a tough time messaging, to pick up Jessica's term here, a kind of pro-growth economic message, because it does cut against, or it seems to cut against some of their messaging on climate and other issues.
We have a question about 2024 and some speculation, a question to get some speculation from all of you about how that race may develop post this election. In other words, how soon will people begin to throw their hats in the ring? Who might be throwing their hats in the ring? Do we assume that Biden will run again? What happens if former President Trump gets indicted? So any thoughts on that from all of you?
I mean, I think Republicans at this point are just happy that Trump didn't announce before the midterm elections, although there is still another week left. That was sort of the nightmare scenario, and that was what was driving a lot of people toward Democrats as well. Because midterm elections should be about the current president, and that was what Republicans wanted them to be about. But with Trump inserting himself into so many races and primaries and being out there and holding rallies, there was quite a lot that voters could make the case that this is an indictment on the former president and his party that are following him. I mean, I wouldn't be shocked to see him get in, very soon thereafter at this point, because I think he needs to distract from possible indictment, what's going on at Mar-a-Lago and different things. I mean, the most interesting one to watch for me is what happens with Ron DeSantis's election, because he's clearly the one that seems most likely to run, even if Trump does.
And Ron DeSantis, just for is the Republican governor of Florida.
Yeah, it did strike me as particularly not an accident when Trump announced that he was going to Florida for a rally with Marco Rubio, who's also up for re-election, but not for DeSantis. So we've kind of seen them. I mean, DeSantis has even been out campaigning for other people. He should win handily his election and might even flip Miami-Dade County. Some Republicans are talking up that particularly, which is a traditionally very strong Democratic area. So I mean, those are sort of the two big question marks, and where do people fall behind there? I mean, we can see Mike Pence running. I think some of the people that have broken from Trump could still run, but I'm not sure that has a path in that regard. So, and with Biden, I mean, he's 80. He's about to turn 80. I don't think you can definitely say he's running until he's definitely not. I mean, you always kind of assume that the incumbent is indeed running, but I mean, what I have seen, particularly in a lot of focus groups I've watched this cycle, I watched a lot with, with people who voted for Trump in 2016 and then voted for Biden in 2020. They don't want either of them to run. They want new people on both sides, but it sort of feels inevitable, at least right now, that like the most likely scenario is still a Biden-Trump matchup.
Bill, any thoughts on from your sources inside the Republican Party?
I totally agree with Jessica about the sentiment out there. And I think this polling would also suggest surprising resistance to both Trump and Biden, even though Trump in an actual just ballot test right now, each would be the leader in his own party. Yeah, Trump's the most likely nominee. Doesn't mean it's a done deal. Maybe it's only 50-50 when you add in all the factors that could stop him. Being indicted will not stop him. If anything, it makes him more inclined to run. And I'm not sure it hurts him in a Republican primary if a Democratic administration indicts him, which is not a reason not to, in my opinion. But I just, analytically, I don't see that it hurts him much. So he'll run most likely, and most likely be the nominee. I actually am more skeptical that Biden will be the nominee than Trump, because I just think every Democrat, almost every Democrat privately sort of hopes that he will choose a kind of to be a successful one-term president instead of trying to run a second time at age 82. And he could be a successful one-term president and could have a lot to be proud of, really, in terms of a transition to the future and stabilizing the country and for Ukraine, and if the inflation comes down, getting us through COVID and so forth. And getting some real legislation passed, as Ira said, in 2022, significant legislation. I mean, then do we just we would have a wide open Democratic primary. The one thing I would say is I do not at all agree with people who say that, oh, Vice President Harris has it, is the prohibitive front runner. I don't even know if she's the front runner. I think it's a wide open race. I'm sort of personally willing to run that risk for generational turnover, because I just think Biden's too old, frankly, to do it again. But a lot of Democrats are with me until that last sentence and then say, oh my God, are we going to go through those 2019 Democratic debates again with 15 candidates, and maybe it's just safer? And Biden did beat Trump. No one else has. So I take that point. But if I had to bet, I mean, I would bet on Harris, Buttigieg, and 3 or 4 others, being in a actual Democratic primary in Iowa and New Hampshire. I guess it won't be Iowa anymore, but in New Hampshire and South Carolina and what other states they put up first, Michigan, in January, February of 2024. But I mean, who knows? This is just one point on the chaos of 2023. What if we had the current situation with everything else that's going on, the violence, the Republican Party, the conspiracists, McCarthy maybe is a new speaker, Pelosi stepping down, a 50-50-ish Senate, and uncertainty about the nominee in both parties, and real question, and not just uncertainty, but sort of real drama, you might say, about what might happen in both parties. It's a very unusual moment in American politics.
Ira, you're a lifelong Democrat. Any thoughts about the 2024 election? And might I add here an observation that if Biden does not run, how does the Democratic Party deny the nomination to a Black woman when Blacks and women are the 2 major constituency groups of the Democratic Party?
Well, look, my predictions on American politics were great in the 20th century. I haven't been too good in the last 20 years, but I have been of the view, or had been of the view, that Trump would not run again, and that's a minority viewpoint. I think that the key on the Republican side, I believe, is that others will not stand by and they'll run. DeSantis will run, Pence may run, others, they won't stand by and let Trump get the nomination. And it'll be interesting to see how they deal with taking him down in a situation where obviously he still has great support within his party. So you have to be a little careful about that. And Republican primaries are generally, I think almost all winner take all primaries. So a plurality candidate can accumulate all these delegates. My view on Biden is that he will have to make a decision relatively early on. And I'm hopeful, I mean, he'll make the decision, and I hope that he personally will regard himself as transitioning to another generation. Simply because I think he's been an excellent president, but I don't think he can confidently say he can do the job for 6 more years, 2 years now and 4 if he's elected. With respect to Bruce's good question, I think the answer is that Democratic voters will decide. If Biden doesn't run, they will decide who will be the nominee. And if cumulatively they decide that it will be Vice President Harris, that's fine. But ultimately, if they decide not to, not to go with her, go with someone else, the party will come together behind that nominee. It is true we don't have an overwhelmingly strong base, bench, but in fact, didn't look like Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama were going to be presidents, nominees, and then presidents until they were. So the Democrats have a habit of turning up new faces every 8 or 10 years.
So who, just briefly, any of you, who do you think could be in the running other than Vice President Harris and maybe Buttigieg? And are there any other likely Democrats, or for that case, Republicans? We've mentioned Pence and DeSantis. Are there other kind of outliers who might pop up in the campaigns?
Well, I think
Cooper is
Nikki
my dark
Haley will
horse.
run.
Yeah.
Don't you, Bill? Jessica?
I'm not sure she will if Trump will. She's bought into Trump world. She was, a critic before she joined the administration. My dark horse on the Democratic side is Roy Cooper, who's the Democratic governor of North Carolina. He's head of the Democratic Governors Association this cycle. He's won, even as Republicans have been vexed in other statewide offices and at the presidential level in the state. So I would look to some of these governors. Really, for a long time, governor was the best path to the White House. It's become the Senate most recently. But these governors have some different claims. I also think there will be some anti-Trump people that run, like Larry Hogan in Maryland, the governor that's term limited this cycle, who's been a Trump critic. So I'd watch for that one too. Chris Sununu, perhaps in New Hampshire, has hinted at it, even as he passed on a Senate bid this year.
I'm a Josh Shapiro guy, since he's a Shapiro. Or actually in Philadelphia, it's pronounced Shapiro.
Okay, Bill, you got to.
I think look, governors, there are Democratic governors in major states. Newsom would like to run from California, Pritzker from Illinois. I don't know that either is the most compelling. Polis has been an excellent governor of Colorado, quite a moderate Democrat pro-business. He's going to win a big re-election in a purplish state. And then I agree, Cooper. And so there are others. I am struck how much, when talking to Democrats, how much Buttigieg would have an edge, as he had a fantastic campaign in 2019-20, went from nowhere to basically tying for the victory in both Iowa and New Hampshire almost. And then, everyone got terrified DeSantis was going to win, and everyone defaulted to Biden. Just on your point, Bruce, for a second, identity politics is very strong among Democratic elites. Democratic voters, whites voted for black voters for Barack Obama against Hillary Clinton, and a lot of them in 2008. Blacks vote for white blacks in South Carolina voted for Joe Biden. Straight Democrats voted for Pete Buttigieg, who's gay. Gay Democrats, men voted for Amy Klobuchar, who's a woman. I don't know. I think the voters are much less into identity politics than the.
A very good point.
So.
Well, anyway, we have reached the witching hour, and that's probably the appropriate term on Halloween. But I want to thank you all for a very fascinating conversation, and some of the questions and comments I've received from the viewers suggest they have enjoyed it as well. We'll see how things work out a week from tomorrow. And as all of you said, we may not know for several days after that. Let's keep our fingers crossed there's no violence. And we'll, I'm sure, be back together talking about elections and politics in America at some point soon. So thank you so much to everybody. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. Thanks,
Thanks.
everyone.